Welcome to the Growing EBITDA podcast, where we unlock the doors to management and technology insights in the middle market. Join us as we explore innovative strategies to drive revenue and EBITDA growth, interviewing industry leaders and technology experts. Whether you're looking to streamline operations, understand the latest tech trends, or lead your company towards exponential growth, you're in the right place. Stay tuned and let's grow together.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Growing EBITDA podcast. Mike, it's great to be back with you. I thought maybe this week we would let you pick the topic. What's on your mind?
Well, myself, just like all of our listeners out there, I think are sitting on the edge of their seats in anticipation for this week's topic. We're going to talk about interim management. So grab the popcorn and get ready, because we're going down that rabbit hole. Who doesn't want to talk about interim management on a Tuesday?
I mean, we definitely do. Since you picked the topic, I guess I do. Let's get into it.
Let's do it. So, reason why everybody's talking about talent shortages, which I don't, a lot of people describe that as a trend, like, oh, it's been really hard to find talent lately. I'm a little bit more than 20 years into my career, and I feel like that trend has been coming up for 20 consecutive years. So it's definitely here to stay. But we're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about maybe how to address those shortages from not the full-time hire perspective, but from the interim side of things, or fractional side of things, maybe depending on who you're talking to, or depending on what kind of role that you're talking about.
Yeah, and that makes sense, Mike, because I think you and I get involved in a lot of transactions, and we see that sometimes there's talent gaps, or folks leave after the transaction happens. It's not like that role goes away. It's not like, hey, we don't have a CEO for the next 3 months. We're just going to shut down business and we'll resume back. The business keeps having to run, so that makes sense.
If you think about it, management teams tend to be fluid. You find some businesses that have the same management team for 15 years, but that's exceedingly rare, I think, these days. Probably find that more in some family-owned businesses, privately held businesses, than you do private equity-backed businesses or larger publicly traded businesses. And given the fluidity of some of those teams, you're going to have people coming and going. And sometimes, you've got folks you can promote from below the person who's leaving, whether they're being pushed out or they're choosing to leave on their own. Many other times you're going to look to the outside and recruit somebody in-house or use a third-party recruiter to help fill those gaps. But sometimes that can take a while. And sometimes, you might have a role, plant manager comes to mind, right? If you've got a 200,000 square foot manufacturing facility and your plant manager leaves, somebody's got to run that plant every single day. Somebody's got to make a lot of decisions on a daily basis to keep that place humming. And oftentimes that, among other examples, is a good opportunity to bring somebody in quickly, right? Now, sometimes it can be challenging to find those folks if they're not at the ready and already in your Rolodex, but we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, so I guess, I don't know, maybe there's something, it seems like you have some things in mind. Maybe there's a question you have for me that we can start with to kind of warm it up, and then we'll turn the back half over to you, since you kind of had the topic thought today. Yeah,
let's do it. Let's dive in a little bit deeper here. So in your experience, why is interim leadership such a strong play during this, in my opinion, 20-year talent shortage that we've had?
It's a little micro gap of 20 years of talent. I think one of the things that's challenging is anytime you come into a new situation, the ability to ramp up quickly is a challenge, because the business has been running, let's pretend, use your 20-year example. The business has been running for 20 years. Things have been happening for 20 years. There's a lot of tribal knowledge. There's a lot of things that have been done. That interim leader that comes in, usually you're going to recruit very strong folks. So I think maybe to talk a little bit about the persona of an interim leader, because we work with a lot of them, is someone with a lot of industry experience. They've been doing this for a while, and they're usually on the stronger side of being able to manage talent and get things done. So you think about this business is moving very quickly for 20 years. I got to bring this individual in and have them ramp quickly. I think that's a nice meeting up of the two talents, because there is obviously going to be a little bit of a gap while you learn, but bringing someone in. Number two is the idea of flexibility. So maybe I don't want to pay 40 hours a week for the individual. I can use them less. Maybe I need someone that can come in for a little bit to get me through. Or maybe I'm a business that just won a large client and I need to put a person in the seat that's my CRO so I can put this CRO in front of a large retailer to win some of that work. You have that ability to use those interim executives, stabilize the business, get it where it needs to be, and either roll them off, use them more, or roll them out of the organization. So it gives you a little bit of flexibility, whereas hiring somebody, you're locked in for a bit. And then there's this last one. This happens a lot in the IT space for us, which is this specialized expertise side. So I really need someone who can be very good at doing this thing and going deep into this. So let's go for an example that's outside of IT, procurement. I'm working on a new product. I need to really start to source from a new nation, or maybe we see it today with the tariff exposure, right? I need to look at secondary sourcing. How do I bring somebody in that's maybe at the procurement level, maybe a procurement manager, procurement director, that's going to come in and handle this multi-sourcing project for me, lead it because they have in-region expertise, they have a deep understanding of what needs to happen, take us through that change curve, and come in and make that happen. I could decide to make that a full-time role after, or not use them after I figure this out. So I'd say that specialization side is important. So really, Mike, I'd say that flexibility, speed, and specialization would probably be the three buckets I would say are most common. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing missing there is, while speed's important, so a lot of the times you get caught off guard by some of these departures, right? So yes, it's speed to impact, I think, is what you're kind of referring to with some of your commentary. Yes, and that speaks to the person's experience and expertise and their ability to hit the ground running, right? But I also think about it through the lens of, if somebody has an abrupt departure, right? Some people pass away, unfortunately, right? Some people suddenly change jobs or have a life issue or career change, and sometimes you can have less than 2 weeks notice for key roles in the business. So I also think about speed from the perspective of, I've got a business issue. I need that plant manager, back to my example. I need somebody there next week because we're about to go live on this, 3-year project that we've been working on to launch our next greatest widget. And my plant manager just left, right? And that's the plant that we're going to make all these new widgets in. So, I think about it from speed from that perspective, right? How to fill a gap quickly that's critical to executing your operating plan.
Well, I mean, it seems like you have some ideas on some of these roles, and we've kind of danced around it by using some anecdotal examples. Maybe let's take a brief pause and have you kind of drill into, where do you see interim management making the biggest difference, and what are those roles?
Yeah, I think first, I want to clarify, in my opinion, the difference between interim management and fractional employees, right? So when I think interim management, I'm thinking about a key managerial role, and that could be down to the controller level, right? Or the general manager level or plant manager level. I'm definitely thinking about it at the executive team level, right? CEO, CFO, COO, et cetera, VP roles. When I think about fractional, and by the way, on interim, I'm thinking about, it may be part-time, but I'm thinking about something that by definition is an interim solution to a longer-term business need, right? Where if you're a $300 million industrial manufacturing business, you need to have a COO. And if your COO abruptly departs and nobody internally can backfill them on a temporary basis, let alone a permanent basis, right? Because we're talking about interim, so everything we're talking about really is temporary. If you don't have somebody internally who can backfill them for 3 to 6 months while you find a long-term solution, that's when you need that interim solution. And the interim solution could be from the inside, right? But it also could be from the outside. Whereas fractional, again, my definition is, we have a need in the business, could be a temporary need, it could be a long-term need, but we're choosing as an entity not to have that capability on a full-time basis in-house. So the example there might be, same $300 million industrial manufacturing business wants to explore how to embed AI into their dumpsters. So who knows, whatever it is that they make. They might go out and seek a fractional technologist to come in a day a week a month, maybe full-time, but for a period of time to advise them on that. That's not really kind of how I think about interim management. I think about interim management as critical roles in a business that are required to keep the business running in some capacity, that you don't have a solution for in-house today, that you're likely recruiting for over time, but you need that temporary solution, that interim solution. Where we see this most commonly is probably in the finance and accounting departments. Most businesses can get by for a few weeks or a few months without that plant manager. Many firms can get by without a vice president of procurement for a couple of months, because oftentimes some of the stuff that those folks are going to be working on is a little bit more long-term in nature, or it's kind of easier to kind of self-regulate on a day in and kind of week in and week out basis. Whereas the financials, you got to report those every month. All the executives need direct and prompt visibility into what's going on in the financials of the company. So oftentimes, you'll see significant demand for temporary interim accounting and finance professionals, because once your site controller leaves or once your CFO leaves abruptly or you've exited them, it's not like you can wait 6 months before you close the books for that plant or for that consolidated P&L. You need every 4 weeks. Your banks most likely are going to want to see what's going on. Your CEO is going to want to see it. Your board's going to want to see it, et cetera. So that's probably the area we see it most commonly. We work a lot in private equity too, and I assume a number of the folks listening are going to know this to be true. But just in case you don't, the single highest turnover role in private equity backed businesses, especially as they transition for the first time to become owned by a private equity fund, the single highest turnover role is not the CEO, it's actually the CFO. And there's a huge industry around interim CFO solutions, because oftentimes it's the first time a company's ever had debt on its balance sheet. And maybe they've already been owned for a little while by a private equity fund. And even if that's the case, because there's oftentimes a lot of leverage in relatively small businesses in the grand scheme of things, the banks, they want those financials every month. They want to understand, the board wants to understand, right? So as soon as you have a finance professional leave on their own accord or pushed out by the new ownership group, you'll often see a lot of interim folks. And I think a lot of people think about interim management. They think about interim CFOs, maybe an interim controller. And there's a huge industry ecosystem, a lot of specialist firms that kind of pure play just put those people into those types of situations. Where we play on the Trivista side, where we've helped a lot of clients, is on the interim operations leadership roles. So, maybe not quite as critical to reporting the financials out every month, but go back to my $300 million industrial manufacturer. Kind of hard for a company like that to live 6 months without a COO, right? Or pretty difficult to run a 200,000 square foot manufacturing facility, maybe 5 states away from the headquarters, without that plant manager or that general manager running that facility on a daily basis. In other cases, you just may find that you just need a particular part of the business that needs some immediate experienced hands to come in and help you fill a gap. So we see a lot of kind of interim COO roles, interim plant managers, interim director of ops, VP of ops, head of procurement, VP supply chain. And obviously, all those roles are focused on keeping the business running, and obviously less focused on keeping the financials up to date, which would be the interim CFO route. Sometimes, and we see this kind of, I would say, if for every interim CFO type role we see in the market, we probably see, for every 20 or 30 interim CFOs, we might see one interim operations position. And it's probably a similar kind of step down into other functional leadership roles. You don't tend to see interim commercial leaders very frequently. You don't tend to see a lot of interim HR leaders. You'll see a lot of fractional HR type resources out there, but those many companies, particularly in the mid-market, will deem themselves capable of kind of getting to the full-time hire without having to bridge that gap with an interim solution. So certainly finance and accounting is kind of the number one biggest chunk of the market, so to speak. Operations is probably a distant second, and then everything else is kind of a distant third. Now, I should point out, we should talk about the CEO for a minute. Very frequently, you're gonna have an interim CEO particularly in mid-market businesses. It's not quite as high of a turnover role as the CFO. And obviously we're talking about a role as opposed to an entire department. When you think about accounting and finance, there's typically one CEO in a $300 million business. There might be 20 finance and accounting professionals, of which maybe 5 are in leadership roles. So, on a count basis, you're going to find far fewer interim CEOs. But that's also an important role, right? You may think that, hey, the board may decide this CEO isn't the right person, or the CEO left or died, or whatever the case may be. And if they think it's going to take a while to get the right person, they may very well bring in an interim solution.
Yeah, that's very helpful and educational. And by the way, I really liked your first part of that discussion because I think even in my description, I conflated the two between fractional and interim. And so just to play that back for everyone and for myself, Mike, I took some notes as we often do on the cast here because I think we educate ourselves just as much as we hopefully are educating our listeners. So interim, I took these notes of it's full-time, usually temporary. They're focused on continuity or crisis management, and it's a typically reactive need. For fractional, it's usually part-time, longer-term type thing. They're most focused on strategy or scalability and alignment. And then the last one, it's a proactive solution and less reactive like the interim. Did I kind of capture those correctly? It's your own notes, but did I capture your own thoughts correctly on here?
Yeah, and I think I'm sure people have examples that'll contradict my experience.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're spot on. You see a lot of, there's a big fractional marketing bench out there, right? A lot of independents, a couple of small firms, but that tends to be something that does a lot of fractional. You don't tend to see a lot of interim chief marketing officers. You don't tend to see a lot of chief marketing officers in a $100 million, $200 million business, especially an industrial one. But yeah, spot on. I think about interim and kind of use 80-20 principles here, right? Like 80% of the time, interim is going to be reactive, filling a gap. It's a continuity issue. Whereas fractional tends to be proactive, outsourcing of a capability not deemed to be core to, having in-house.
No, that's really helpful. And I think I've mixed those terms up. So we support a lot of groups with VCIO services. And I'm sure in those moments, I've probably said interim in there. And I guess if I even look at the definition of the word, I've probably been using it incorrectly. So I appreciate a good education.
By the way, I'm happy to give you an English lesson after the.
Yeah, I was going to say, after I read it, I'm like, crap, this is and I do love how graceful.
I'll have my buddy Bezos. Let me open my phone here. My buddy Bezos send you a dictionary so you can start to educate yourself. How's that sound?
I do love how you wove in you're incorrect in your examples into your answer, which is great. So it's always good. And by the way,
I do it politely? Did I do it graciously?
Yes, I would say I took that fractional knowledge and I'm going to apply it in the interim. But I appreciate it. Okay, well, just like I'm getting some serious value out of this, maybe we could talk about how do kind of organizations, or even in our case, sometimes PE funds, because sometimes they're the ones that are reaching out. How do I make sure I get a win by bringing these folks in? Because obviously it's not cheap. You and I both know that. It sometimes can be very wrong and a misfit. How do I figure out that win and make sure I'm structured and prepared before I bring this individual in, or even attempt to?
Yeah. So I think that for starters, being realistic about what you're trying to achieve is really important, right? Where I've seen a lot of people do this wrong is they say, hey, listen, I need to go hire a new whatever the role is, right? Let's just use COO as an example. I need to go hire a new COO because my current one left, or I kicked him out or her out or whatever the case may have been. And they sit down and they start scoping it out with the executive recruiting firm. And they say, hey, there's all these traits and characteristics and industry experiences that we want. Go find them. Executive search firm says, great, need 3 to 6 months. And the board's sitting there going, well, geez, I don't have 3 to 6 months, right? Like I want that person and fine, I get it 3 to 6 months. But what do I do over the next 3 to 6 months? Because I got to keep the lights on. I got to keep continuity front of mind here. Where I see a lot of people go wrong is they simultaneously go looking for an interim solution that looks like their full-time solution. But they want that tomorrow. And if it was that easy, you probably could just find your long-term solution tomorrow, right? But it's not. And I think that being honest with yourself about what you're trying to achieve, this is a stopgap, which by the way, the price tag associated with this, which oftentimes is a multiple of what the full-time hire might cost, this is expensive, right? So I think a lot of people try to be very thoughtful about it, which you obviously need to be thoughtful about it, but you kind of can't overthink it at the same time. You kind of got to go, listen, this is a stopgap. I don't need the best person in the world because it's unlikely that you're going to find the best person in the world on the very first try by next Monday when you need them at, some critical client meeting or whatever the case may be at that site to go run it. So just being realistic about, what you're trying to achieve and like what the minimum viable capabilities and experience set of this person should have. I see a lot of people go to their network and say, hey, who in my Rolodex, former executives that they've worked with, maybe at prior businesses or that they've come across. We see a lot of people kind of go there first, which sometimes can be the solution. Another solution is going to firms, obviously like Trivista, who specialize in certain niches, right? So don't come to us for, hey, I need an interim software developer, right? We don't have any of those in our Rolodex, but hey, I need an interim COO, VP of Ops, VP supply chain. Go call somebody who's got a broad network, who's already in this business, who already places these kinds of candidates on an interim basis, who understands the business model, and who's got a deep Rolodex of folks that, you say, hey, I need a person in this geography. Maybe it's very site specific role. I need somebody in this geography with about 25 years experience. They have to have led teams of 300 people in a heavy industrial manufacturing environment, right? Somebody like that can quickly go to a network and get you some viable candidates. So I think being realistic about what it is that you're looking for and not going to look for like a purple polka dotted llama, because those don't exist anywhere. Just being realistic about that from the get go, tapping some resources like some firms who do this for a living and help businesses fill these gaps is a key second piece. I think having a clear mandate for the person once they show up too, right? And being realistic about how much change do you actually think somebody can drive in 3 months, right? Like being realistic about, am I looking for somebody who can provide continuity? Or am I going to try and take that person who I'm asking to help drive continuity and then do a bunch of change management, right? And I think you can only do so much change in a couple of months, especially in certain roles. Like oftentimes I encourage people, wait to do the change until you have the full-time person. Like bring in the part-time person, bring in that interim resource, that steady pair of hands to make sure you don't have more departures, to make sure you ship product on time, to make sure you're talking with your customers in the right way. But don't try and boil the ocean. Don't have somebody with a bunch of experience come in and then all of a sudden give them 20 other things that you think that you want them to do and change and dilute their ability to impact the business in the way that you originally intended, right? So I think that's key. Also empowering them, right? If somebody's going to be an interim COO, don't bring them in and call them a consultant and then expect the entire team to rally around their leadership, right? You have to empower them to make decisions. Just like you're going to have to empower your full-time person to come in and do that. Now, you oftentimes are going to vet a full-time person more than you're going to vet some of these interim resources. And that's why it's important in many cases to try and seek out a firm that does that, fills those kind of roles for a living, because hopefully and presumably they've done an extensive amount of sector-specific, role-specific vetting and reference checking. Maybe they've worked with this individual in the past. Those are all kind of good things to have done, because again, we're talking about interim stopgaps, right? Oftentimes in a very abrupt environment, an executive leaves, you're trying to find a solution in a matter of weeks. You don't have time often to go through lengthy interview processes across the board and the executive management team, et cetera. So I think just being realistic, having that clear mandate, not overburdening them with projects that are going to dilute their impact on keeping the lights on and keeping the operation running is key. And then also just making sure that you're upfront with that person about the timeline and, the expectations and the deliverables, and, making sure that they understand, which they often do. It's an interim role. If they're the right person, they should get this, that they're not the permanent person that you're looking for, right? That you're going to be looking for someone, and you may in fact want to engage them in the search in some capacity, because they're going to have very unique insights into the business, the culture, the needs of the organization. They may be able to help you tease out whether or not your long-term fit, your long-term permanent hire is going to be a good fit or not.
Yeah, those are really good. I think I really like two parts. Number one, they're not a consultant that's coming in, so they're meant to run it. They're not going to have this, superpower to have a lot more free time compared to the previous group. That's a really good one. And then I think the thing that's interesting to me while I was listening to you, some of those tips are good for just your current employees. Be transparent, be upfront, give them clear directive. Like, it's a lot of the stuff, and you can't just assume that you treat that any different. So I really like that.
Well, I'll be honest with you, James. Yeah. One of the things that we find is, and this obviously assumes you get the right person in the interim slot, but one of the things that we have found over the years, when we've dropped interim managers into our clients' businesses, the client comes back and says, wow, like, they've had a profound impact. Like, we really like this person. Oftentimes they'll try and hire him. In many cases, it's like, well, that guy lives in Florida and your site's in Seattle and it's 3 stops to get there and he's not moving, right? So he's not going to be your full-time guy. But oftentimes we'll have clients say like, wow, how did they get that much done in 2 months? And a lot of the times it's because the other leaders in the business were smart enough not to overburden them with things that weren't critical to continuity, right? So rather than getting that person caught up in a bunch of recurring meetings that don't add a lot of value, right? You're just kind of letting them go and execute, and they're just highly focused. So I think your point that you were making is like, hey, some parallels here, some metaphors, some lessons to be applied to maybe other permanent roles in the business. Well, some lessons to be applied to that role in the business too, right? Let your people stay focused on the right things. Don't bog them down in things that they don't need to be involved in. And sometimes magic happens.
Have you ever filled an interim role for a business?
Not in a kind of formal way. I think I've acted in interim roles kind of more informally in some of the businesses that I've been involved with, particularly some of the ones that we've invested in over the years. But not formally. But some of our partners have, and something we do a lot of.
Yeah, it's the reason I asked that, Mike, because I think I'm more using it in a fractional perspective than an interim perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think a lot of times now that I have the definitions correct, I was an interim CIO for a carve out for a business they were making it so SpinCo needed to stand alone, and they needed an IT leader to sit there for 4 months until the strategic took them over. But that was a pretty light duty. But I think most of the time I spent on the fractional side. And I think it might be interesting to get some perspective. Maybe we can find someone in our network that would come talk to us about being an interim. Because I think the other angle I think is interesting here, Mike, as you were talking is because our listeners, so we get the analytics on our listeners, right, are typically mid-market business, mostly executives or PE folks. I think the inverse of this that I think is interesting is if I'm at a business today and I know the business is about to transact and I'm pretty sure I'm not going to go forward, a sunset type thing for me could be an interim role somewhere. Like if I'm a COO that's currently doing at a business, I'm thinking about trying to slow down. And it might be interesting to have a conversation and get someone on to talk to us about, hey, you're considering what your next role is, maybe trying to get in this interim, I guess a bit of a hamster wheel because it does change. But this interim space is interesting, and maybe getting someone on the line to talk about it. I know a particular person from Florida that when you said Florida, it made me think about it, having them come on and talk about what it's like to be in that role and how folks can be in that. Because number one, we always need good sourcing because we need folks in to be able to send folks out. And number two, it might be helpful to educate some of our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing that you're jogging my memory on now is just my experience. So even though I haven't done a lot of interim roles personally, I've placed a lot of people in interim roles over the years, helping clients. Sometimes it's been with some of the full-time consultants on the Trivista team. Many of the time it's people from our broader network that we're dropping in. And one of the things that I think some people get right and some people don't get right is when people see the price tag on interim, oftentimes it's very off-putting, right? Mm-hmm. So if I'm used to paying a plant manager, I don't know, let's just pick just round numbers for example purposes. If I'm used to paying my plant manager $100,000 a year, and I go out and I'm like, listen, I need an interim solution while I look for this. Maybe I know it's going to be hard to fill this role. It's going to probably take me 6 months. When they get interim solutions to come through, I've seen a lot of people find somebody from their own network. Oftentimes it's somebody who like lives in the town, was a brother of a guy on the shop floor, whatever the case may be. And it's like, oh, well, on a run rate basis, this person's more like 130 grand a month. That's not that bad. So yeah, let's drop that person in and see how they do. It's really just a kind of a continuity thing anyway. That's kind of like the cheap route. Like there's a little bit of premium to going with that person on a part-time basis. They're optimistic that they'll get back to that 100 grand level when they find the full-time hire. Many times we've seen folks come to us and others like us who provide these kind of services in certain niches. And they're like, well, wait a second. I was paying 100 grand on a run rate basis. This is like $300,000, right? Like I can't afford that. And I think this is kind of one of those things where you kind of got to be careful, tread carefully here. Oftentimes you get what you pay for. And I think you just got to be really serious about how critical is the role. How much of a leader do I need in this seat, right? Which would be very different at the COO level, maybe versus like an assistant controller level in a business. And recognize that if you're going to go to some of these outside firms who are going to help maintain a Rolodex for you such that they can drop somebody in relatively short order and be accretive to you and valuable to you in the selection and placement process, that you're going to have to pay for it. Because certainly you get the wrong person in a critical role, right? If you need to hire an interim solution, it's probably a critical role. Don't go cheap, because at the end of the day, it's it should be a very short-term thing. It's typically an adjustment to the financials, right? So just be thoughtful about cheap is not always your friend here, right?
Yeah, no, great point. Yeah, and just for our listeners, I think you meant 130,000 a year.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, because I would make that a $1 million plant manager, which, by the way, for $1 million plant manager, imagine what you could produce.
Yeah. One would hope.
One would hope. Hey, all right. Well,
long line of plant managers signing up to that role.
I got a pen
I'd
right
be
here.
one of them. I'm not even a plant manager.
I got a pen right here. I figured it out.
Yeah.
Back to our earlier episode, GPT my way to success. All right.
I can plant plants.
All right, let's wrap up with some trivia. I looked it up just based on some of the conversations. You said something around, the folks being temporary. It kind of struck something, so I just quickly GPT'd a question. How long does an average executive search take to complete? Was my original question, but I'm changing the question. I'm going to spice it up because you made that comment. What percentage of interim executives are hired to be in that full-time role? I think is a better question.
I bet you it's like, you want to think it's high, but it's probably not all that high. I'm going to say 8 to 12%, somewhere in that range.
Pretty dang close, man. We'll give you a quarter point for that.
A quarter point. A whole quarter point.
Yes. Well, you gave me half a point last week. So you're 1.25 to 0.5 is our score right now. But it's roughly 20 to 30%. So it's interesting. And by the way, so GPT gives you copious amounts of context anytime you search for anything, right? And it came back and said it shows that they're not just bridging the gap, that they can also become part of the solution. I think that's a low percent, but they're quoting that's a pretty high percent. So I think a lot of times I expect people to roll. So yeah, 20 to 30% of the people you bring on in an interim role could become your FTE.
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably varies widely by interim role. There are and industry type. I bet you it's kind of all over the map, right? So if you go to like the plant manager example, oftentimes you'll get into a small town in the Midwest, in the Rust Belt, where the facility that needs that plant manager is the largest employer in town. Next closest industrial employer may only have an eighth of the number of headcount, right? So you may immediately have to be looking pretty far away, right? You're going to have to extend that radius out pretty far to find somebody with the right skill set who also happens to be available, who also is going to pass your criteria. And in many roles, you're going to be flying folks in. Certainly, the higher up you get, the more difficult it is to find folks in the immediate geography. Oftentimes, there's a lot of travel involved. And a lot of those folks, if you're thinking about like an interim COO, a lot of times you're going to be talking about folks who are in their late 40s, 50s, 60s with the kind of experience that you need to drop them in. A lot of those people they're not moving, right? So yes, your plant may be in Seattle or your business may be in Maine, but they might live in Florida, Texas, Southern California, right? So mapping that out oftentimes is kind of just a hurdle. It's not a hurdle to send them in temporarily, but it's a hurdle to get them on the team full time, even if they are really, really great. It certainly does happen though, right? You can incent them. A lot of people can be convinced, but a lot of people can't be convinced, right? So whereas I think in some interim roles, particularly in accounting and finance, that tends to be a very geographically driven business. So for example, if you need a controller, an interim controller in San Diego, there are firms that are San Diego based or have offices in San Diego that just do finance and accounting placement work. So the conversion there from interim to full time is probably going to happen a lot more frequently because they likely have resources who are already there, because nobody wants to pay $5,000 a week in travel expenses to bring in a controller who they're only paying $85 an hour to come into that interim role, right? So it's just a little bit different, but yeah, it's definitely not a high percentage of interim to full-time conversion.
No, that's great context. I think one of the things I walk away from in today's conversation is it's something that I should look for more and talk about more, because it is an offering that we have, frankly, and it sometimes falls to the bottom of the sort order when we're talking with clients. We're so focused, back to my two definitions, on really making sure I get them right. We're so focused on that fractional side that I think the interim side is something that I need to bring into my lexicon more and discuss with our clients. I appreciate the context today and walking us through. It was really helpful for me, at least. I walked away understanding more and some ideas for future episodes.
Great. Happy to help.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in to Growing EBITDA, folks. I appreciate it. Feel free to subscribe. We always like when folks do that. And we look forward to catching up next time.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Growing EBITDA. If you like this episode, hit subscribe or follow us on LinkedIn for updates. Got a topic you'd like us to cover? Drop us a message. We'd love to hear from you.